Clara's just a clerk, closing up the Hollow Creek post office on a stormy night, when a stranger knocks, his eyes cold as death, handing her a blank envelope that hums with dark secrets. The old building creaks, shadows twist, and whispers of a cursed past come alive. Trapped by locked doors and a glowing, writhing letter, Clara must face a choice: obey the stranger or fight the evil waking inside the walls. Will she escape or become part of the post office's haunting forever? Dive into a rainy night at the post office, where every tick of the clock pulls you deeper into terror. Chapter 1. The Storm Begins. Rain slammed against the roof of the Hollow Creek post office, loud as 100 hammers. Clara, the only clerk still there, stood behind the counter, her hands sorting letters in a steady rhythm. The clock on the wall read 9:47 p.m., its red numbers glowing faintly in the dim light. 13 minutes until closing. She sighed, her breath puffing out in the chilly air. Nobody would come this late, not in this storm. The wind howled outside, shaking the windows like it wanted to break them. Inside, the small room smelled of wet paper, old wood, and the faint tang of ink. Clara was 24, with short brown hair tucked behind her ears, and a faded blue sweater that hung loose on her frame. She'd worked at the post office for 2 years, ever since moving to Hollow Creek, a tiny town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The job was simple: sort mail, stamp packages, smile at customers, but it paid the bills. Most nights, she liked the quiet. It gave her time to think, to dream about leaving for a bigger city someday. But tonight, the quiet felt heavy, like the air was holding its breath. The post office was old, built long before Clara was born. Its walls were lined with dark wood panels, scratched and worn from decades of use. The floor creaked under her. Sneakers and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, pale glow. There were 2 counters, one for customers and one for sorting, both cluttered with stacks of envelopes and parcels. A rusty bell hung above the front door, jingling whenever someone came in. Behind Clara was a narrow hallway leading to a back room where extra supplies and a dusty coffee maker sat. The place wasn't much, but it was hers to manage until 10 p.m. She glanced out the front window, but all she saw was rain. It poured down in thick silver curtains, blurring the street outside. The streetlights flickered, their yellow glow barely cutting through the dark. Hollow Creek was a sleepy place, with a grocery store, a diner, and a few shops that closed by 7 p.m. At this hour, the town felt empty, swallowed by the storm. Clara shivered, pulling her sweater tighter. The heater in the post office was broken again, and the damp air seeped through the walls. Her hands moved faster, sorting the last pile of mail. Letters went into slots labelled by street names: Maple, Oak, Cedar. Parcels got stacked in a bin for delivery tomorrow. She liked the routine. It kept her mind busy. But tonight, her thoughts wandered. She'd heard stories about the post office, whispers from old-timers at the diner. They said strange things happened here, especially on stormy nights. Letters disappearing, shadows moving where they shouldn't. One old man, Mr. Hargrove, swore he'd seen a face in the window once, staring in from the rain. Clara didn't believe in ghosts, but the stories stuck in her head like a song you can't forget. She shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. Just a creepy old building, she muttered. Her voice sounded small in the empty room. The rain answered, pounding harder, like it was trying to drown her out. She checked the clock again. 9:49 p.m. 11 minutes to go. She'd lock up, walk the 3 blocks to her apartment, and curl up with a mug of tea. The storm would pass, and tomorrow would be normal again. Clara reached for a stack of envelopes, her fingers brushing the rough paper. Most were bills or ads, but a few were handwritten, with neat cursive or messy scrawls. She liked those best. They felt personal, like little pieces of someone's life. One letter caught her eye, addressed to a Mrs. Eleanor Tate. Clara knew her, an elderly woman who lived on Pine Street. The handwriting was shaky, probably from a grandchild. Clara smiled, sliding it into the right slot. It was moments like this that made the job feel worthwhile. The wind screamed outside, rattling the front door in its frame. Clara jumped, her heart skipping. Get a grip, she told herself. It was just the storm. She grabbed a broom from the corner and started sweeping, needing to move. The floor was littered with bits of paper and dust, the kind of mess that built up in a place this old. As she swept, she noticed a crack in the wall near the counter, thin but deep, like someone had carved it with a knife. She frowned. Had that always been there? The post office was full of quirks, loose floorboards, leaky pipes, but she didn't remember this. She knelt to look closer, the broom resting against her shoulder. The crack ran vertically, about a foot long, and inside it the wood looked darker, almost black. She reached out, her fingers hovering over it, but stopped. The air around the crack felt colder, like a draught from somewhere deep. A shiver ran down her spine. "Stupid!" she whispered, standing up. It was just a crack. Old buildings had them. Still, she moved the broom faster, eager to finish and get out. The clock ticked to 9:51 p.m. 9 minutes left. Clara's eyes darted to the front door, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the glass showed only rain and darkness. She laughed, a short, nervous sound. "You're freaking yourself out for nothing." She set the broom aside and went back to the counter, grabbing a rag to wipe it down. The wood was smooth under her hands, polished by years of use. She traced a scratch on the surface, wondering who'd made it. A bored clerk? A kid with a key? The post office was full of little mysteries like that, marks of people long gone. Her thoughts drifted to her life in Hollow Creek. She'd come here after college, looking for something simple, while she figured out her next step. The town was quiet, the kind of place where nothing big ever happened. At first, she'd liked that, but 2 years in, she felt stuck. Her friends from school were in cities, chasing careers or adventures. Clara was still here, sorting mail in a creaky old building. She wanted more, maybe a job in a museum, or a trip somewhere far away. But dreams like that needed money, and money needed time. The rain slowed for a moment, then roared back, louder than before. Clara's stomach twisted. She didn't like storms. They reminded her of when she was a kid, hiding under her blanket while thunder shook the house. Her mum used to sing to her, soft songs about sunny days. Clara hummed one now, barely a whisper, trying to calm her nerves. Blue skies, warm light, everything's all right. The words felt silly, but they helped. She checked the clock. 9:53 p.m. 7 minutes. She started her closing routine, locking the cash drawer and turning off the extra lights. The room grew dimmer, the shadows deeper. The buzzing fluorescents stayed on, but they flickered now and then, making the walls seem to shift. Clara ignored it, focusing on her tasks. She counted the stamps, checked the bins, and made sure the back door was locked. Everything was in order, just like always, but the feeling wouldn't leave her. It was like the post office was watching, waiting. She glanced at the crack in the wall again, half expecting it to be bigger. It wasn't, but the sight of it made her skin prickle. She turned away, grabbing her jacket from a hook by the counter. It was green, waterproof, perfect for the walk home. She slipped it on, the fabric crinkling, and zipped it up. Her sneakers were already damp from stepping in puddles earlier, but she'd manage. The wind howled again, and something scraped against the window. Clara spun, her heart pounding. It was just a branch, caught in the storm, but for a second she'd thought, what? A hand? A face? She laughed, shaky. You're losing it, Clara. She needed to get out of here, storm or no storm. The post office was getting to her, with its creaks and shadows and stupid ghost stories. She grabbed her keys, ready to lock up early. Nobody would know. She'd tell her boss, Mr. Jenkins, that the storm was too bad. He'd understand. Clara stepped toward the front door, keys jingling in her hand. The rain was still falling, but it looked lighter now, more drizzle than downpour. She could make it home in 10 minutes if she hurried. Then a sharp knock echoed. Through the room, Clara froze, her hand on the door handle. The sound came again. 3 quick raps, loud and deliberate. Someone was out there. Her mouth went dry. Who would be at the post office this late, in this weather? She squinted through the glass, but the rain smeared everything into a blur. A shape stood under the awning, dark and still. Clara's heart thudded. She didn't want to open the door, but what if it was someone who needed help? A neighbour or a lost traveller? She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the keys. Just see who it is, she whispered. She unlocked the door, the bell jingling as it swung open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and something else. Earth, maybe, or decay. Clara stood in the doorway, staring at the figure outside, and waited for them to speak. Chapter 2. The Stranger. Clara stood in the open doorway of the hollow creak post office, her hand gripping the cold metal handle. Rain dripped from the awning above, splashing onto the concrete step outside. The air smelled sharp, like wet dirt, and something sour she couldn't place. Her heart thumped hard, loud enough that she wondered if the figure in front of her could hear it. The stranger stood just beyond the doorway, a dark shape under the awning, his coat shiny with water. His hood hid his face, casting it in shadow. The clock inside read 9:48 p.m., 12 minutes until closing, but time felt stuck, like the storm had frozen the world. "Who's there?" Clara asked, her voice sharper than she meant. She squinted, trying to see past the rain and darkness. The stranger didn't answer right away. He shifted, his boots scraping the wet concrete, and stepped closer. The bell above the door jingled softly as the wind pushed it. Clara's stomach twisted. She wanted to shut the door, lock it, and pretend no one was there. But her feet stayed, planted, her curiosity mixing with fear. What kind of person came to a post office this late, in a storm like this? The stranger reached up and pushed his hood back just enough for her to see his chin, rough with stubble, and a thin mouth that didn't smile. His eyes stayed hidden under the hood's edge. "Need to mail something," he said, his voice low and scratchy, like he hadn't spoken in days. He held out a small envelope, plain and white, no bigger than a birthday card. It was dry somehow, despite the rain soaking everything else. Clara stared at it, her fingers twitching at her sides. Something about the envelope felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. She forced herself to move, stepping back into the post office and letting the door swing wider. "Come in, then," she said, trying to sound calm. "But we're closing soon." The stranger stepped inside, his boots leaving wet prints on the creaky wood floor. The bell jingled again, louder this time, and the door thudded shut behind him. Clara's throat tightened. She glanced at the phone on the counter, but the storm had knocked out the line hours ago. She was alone with this man, in a building that already felt too alive with shadows. The post office was small and dim, lit by buzzing fluorescent lights that flickered every few seconds. The walls, dark with old wood, seemed to soak up the light, making the room feel smaller. Stacks of letters and parcels cluttered the counter, and the air smelled of damp paper and ink. Clara moved behind the counter, putting it between her and the stranger. It wasn't much, but it felt safer, like a shield. She wiped her sweaty palms on her jeans and looked at the man. "What do you need to mail?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid the envelope across the counter, his hand slow and deliberate. His fingers were pale, almost grey, with dirt under the nails. Clara noticed a faint tremor in his hand, like he was nervous or cold. The envelope stopped in front of her, plain and unmarked. No address, no name, no stamp. Just a blank piece of paper sealed tight. She frowned, picking it up. It was heavier than it looked, and the paper felt thick, almost waxy. "This needs an address," she said, looking up at him. "And postage. I can't send it like this." The stranger's head tilted, and for a moment she caught a glint of his eyes under the hood, dark, sharp, like a bird watching her. "It'll get where it's going," he said, his voice softer now, but heavier, like it carried a secret. Clara's skin prickled. She set the envelope down, not wanting to hold it any more. "That's not how it works," she said, crossing her arms. "There are rules. You need to write who it's for, where it's going, and pay for a stamp." Her words sounded braver than she felt. Inside, her heart was racing, and her legs itched to run. The man didn't move. He stood there, water dripping from his coat onto the floor, pooling around his boots. The lights flickered again, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch, curling like fingers. Clara swallowed, her mouth dry. She'd been in Hollow Creek for 2 years, long enough to know the town's quirks. People here were friendly, predictable. They brought in birthday cards, bills, or packages for grandkids in other states. Nobody showed up at 9:48 p.m. with a blank envelope, and a voice that made your bones feel cold. She thought about the stories she'd heard, the ones she'd laughed off. Hollow Creek's post office was old, older than most buildings in town. Built In 1893, it had seen floods, fires, and worse, according to the old-timers. They talked about clerks who quit after seeing things. Lights turning on by themselves, letters moving in the bins. One woman, Mrs. Carver, swore she'd heard whispering in the back room. Words she couldn't quite make out. Clara had rolled her eyes at the time. Old buildings creaked. Shadows played tricks. But now, with this stranger staring at her, those stories didn't seem so funny. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't expect an answer, but she needed to say something to fill the silence. The stranger's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a messenger," he said, "like you." The words sent a chill down her spine. She wasn't a messenger, not really. She was a clerk, sorting mail for minimum wage, dreaming of a life somewhere else. But the way he said it made it sound like they were part of the same secret, something bigger than this tiny post office. Clara shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. "Look, I can't help you if you don't follow the rules," she said, louder now. She picked up the envelope again, holding it out to him. "Take it back, write an address, and come back tomorrow." Her hand shook, and she hoped he didn't notice. The envelope felt warm now, like it had been sitting in the sun, not in a cold, rainy post office. She wanted it gone, out of her hands, out of her life. The stranger leaned forward, his hands pressing against the counter. The wood creaked under his weight, and Clara stepped back, her sneakers squeaking on the floor. "Put it in the outgoing bin," he said, his voice low and firm, like he was giving an order. "Someone will collect it." His words hung in the air, heavy and wrong. Clara's breath caught. The outgoing bin was just a metal box by the counter, where she put mail for the morning pickup. It was ordinary, boring, but the way he said it made it sound like something else, something dangerous. "Who's going to collect it?" she asked, her voice trembling. She clutched the envelope tighter, her fingers digging into the paper. The stranger's eyes glinted again, and this time she saw them clearly, dark, almost black, with no warmth. "Someone who's been waiting," he said. His voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it over the rain, but the words sank into her cold and heavy. Waiting for what? For this envelope? For her? Her mind spun, trying to make sense of it, but nothing fit. The lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat. Clara gasped, her free hand grabbing the counter to steady herself. When the lights came back, the stranger was still there, closer now, his face inches from hers. She hadn't seen him move. His hood had slipped back a little more, showing a gaunt cheek and a scar running from his ear to his jaw. His skin looked too pale, like he'd been sick for a long time. "Don't make this hard," he said, his breath warm and sour against her face. Clara's legs felt weak, but she didn't back down. "I'm not doing anything until you explain," she said, her voice cracking but firm. She shoved the envelope back toward him, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped it. The stranger stared at her, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment she thought he might grab her. But he didn't. He straightened up, pulling his hood tighter, and stepped back. The air felt lighter, like a weight had lifted, but Clara's heart still pounded. "Fine," he said, his voice flat. "Keep it for now, but you'll send it." He turned toward the door, his boots thudding on the floor. The bell jingled as he pushed it open, and the rain roared louder, swallowing his shape as he stepped into the storm. The door slammed shut, and Clara was alone again, the envelope still in her hand. She stared at it, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The clock ticked to 9:50 p.m., 10 minutes until closing, but she knew she wouldn't leave yet. Not with that envelope, and not with those words echoing in her head. Chapter 3. The Unsettling Request. Clara stood frozen behind the counter of the Hollow Creek post office, the stranger's envelope clutched in her trembling hands. The clock on the wall ticked to 9:50 p.m., its red numbers glowing like a warning, 10 minutes until closing, but the world outside felt far away, drowned in the relentless rain. The stranger's words echoed in her mind. "Put it in the outgoing bin. Someone will collect it." His voice, low and rough, had carried a weight that made her stomach churn. She stared at the envelope, plain and white, no address or stamp, just a sealed secret she didn't want to touch. The air in the post office felt thick, like it was pressing down on her, and the faint smell of wet dirt lingered, even though the stranger was gone. The room was dim, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry bees. The dark wood walls seemed to swallow the light, making the space feel smaller, tighter. Stacks of letters and parcels cluttered the counter, their edges curling in the damp air. The floor creaked under Clara's sneakers, and the rusty bell above the front door swayed slightly, as if the wind outside was still pushing it. She glanced at the door, half expecting to see the stranger's shadow through the glass, but there was only rain, pounding the street in silver waves. Her heart thumped hard, and her mouth was dry as sand. Clara set the envelope down, her fingers shaking so much she nearly dropped it. It landed with a soft thud, heavier than it should have been for something so small. She wiped her hands on her jeans, as if the envelope had left a mark she couldn't see. "This is crazy," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the storm's roar. She wanted to laugh, to shake off the fear creeping up her spine, but the stranger's words wouldn't leave her. Someone will collect it. Who? And why did it feel like he wasn't talking about the mailman? She paced behind the counter, her sneakers squeaking on the worn wood floor. The post office had always been a quiet place, a boring job that paid her rent. She'd sort mail, chat with customers, and lock up at 10:01 p.m. But tonight, it felt different, like the building was alive, watching her. Clara had been in Hollow Creek for 2 years, long enough to know the town's stories. The post office was old, built in 1893, and locals loved to talk about it. They said letters vanished sometimes, or ended up in the wrong bins. Old Mr. Hargrove at the diner swore he'd heard footsteps in the empty back room. Clara had thought it was just small-town gossip, something to scare kids. Now she wasn't so sure. She stopped pacing and looked at the envelope again. It sat there, innocent but wrong, like a spider pretending to be still. Clara's skin prickled. She didn't want to touch it, but she couldn't ignore it either. What was inside? A letter? Something worse? The stranger had called himself a messenger, but messengers didn't show up in storms with blank envelopes and creepy smiles. She thought about his face, what little she'd seen. Pale skin, a scar on his jaw, eyes like black stones. He wasn't from Hollow Creek. She'd have recognized him. The town was small, barely 1,000 people, and strangers stood out. Clara's eyes darted to the phone on the counter. She grabbed it, hoping the line had come back, but the receiver was silent, no dial tone. The storm had cut her off, trapping her in this creaky old building with that envelope. She slammed the phone down, harder than she meant to, and the sound echoed sharp and loud. The lights flickered, and for a second the shadows on the walls seemed to twist, like they were reaching for her. She gasped, stepping back, her hip bumping the counter. "Stop it," she told herself, her voice shaky. "It's just a storm, just a weird guy." But it wasn't just a guy. She could still feel his presence, like he'd left something behind. The air smelled wrong, not just of rain, but of something earthy, like a freshly dug grave. Clara shivered, pulling her green jacket tighter. She wanted to lock up and run home, but the envelope held her there, like a puzzle she had to solve. She reached for it again, hesitating, then picked it up. It was warm, too warm for a rainy night, and the paper felt smooth, almost slick. She turned it over, looking for any mark, but it was blank, sealed shut with a thin line of glue. "What's your deal?" she muttered, holding the envelope up to the light. The fluorescent glow showed nothing. No shadow of words inside, no hint of what it held. But it felt heavy, like it was carrying more than paper. Clara's mind raced. Maybe it was a prank, some teenager messing with her. Or maybe it was something illegal. Drugs, money, something she didn't want to know about. But the stranger's voice didn't sound like a prankster's, and his eyes hadn't looked like they belonged to a criminal. They'd looked empty, like he was carrying a burden he couldn't shake. She set the envelope down and rubbed her eyes, trying to think. She'd been alone in the post office plenty of times, working late shifts when the town was asleep. It was never fun, but it was safe. Hollow Creek wasn't the kind of place where bad things happened. People left their doors unlocked, waved at neighbours, bought coffee at the diner, but the post office had a reputation, one Clara had ignored until now. Her boss, Mr. Jenkins, had mentioned it once, half joking. "This place has stories," he'd said, tapping the counter. "Folks say it's got a mind of its own." She'd laughed then, but the memory made her stomach twist now. Clara walked to the front door, checking the lock. It was secure. The bolt clicked into place, but she tugged it anyway, needing to be sure. The glass was cold under her fingers, streaked with rain. Outside, the street was empty, the streetlights flickering in the downpour. She pressed her forehead against the glass, her breath fogging it up. She wanted to go home, to her small apartment with its cosy lamp and warm blanket. But the envelope was still on the counter, and the stranger's words were still in her head. Someone who's been waiting. She turned back to the counter, her sneakers scuffing the floor. The envelope hadn't moved, but it seemed to draw her in, like it was calling her name. Clara shook her head, trying to clear the thought. "You're freaking yourself out," she said louder this time, hoping her voice would chase away the fear. She grabbed a stack of letters from the counter, pretending to sort them, but her eyes kept flicking to the envelope. It didn't belong with the others, with their neat addresses and colourful stamps. It was out of place, like a stranger in a furrow. familiar room. Clara thought about the stranger again, replaying the moment he'd walked in. His coat had been soaked, but the envelope was dry. How? He'd been standing in the rain, under the awning, but still exposed to the storm. She hadn't noticed it at the time, too caught up in his voice and his eyes. But now it bothered her. And his hands, pale, trembling, with dirt under the nails, like he'd been digging or clawing at something. The thought made her shiver, and she pushed it away, focusing on the counter instead. The counter was old, scratched and polished by years of use. Clara ran her fingers over a deep gouge, wondering who'd made it. Maybe another clerk, bored on a slow night, or maybe someone, like her, scared and alone, facing something they didn't understand. She glanced at the crack in the wall, the one she'd noticed earlier. It was still there, thin and dark, like a scar on the wood. She hadn't thought much of it before, but now it seemed important, like a clue she was missing. The post office was full of marks like that, scratches, dents, stains. Each one told a story, if you knew how to listen. Clara's mind drifted to her life in Hollow Creek. She'd come here after college, looking for a fresh start. The town was quiet, safe, the kind of place where nothing changed. At first, she'd liked that, but now, 2 years later, she felt trapped, like she was moving in slow motion while the world sped by. Her friends were in cities, chasing dreams, while she was here, sorting mail in a building that smelled like rain and secrets. She wanted more, a job she loved, a city full of life, maybe even a chance to travel. But those things felt far away, especially tonight. The rain pounded harder, and the lights flickered again, longer this time. Clara held her breath, waiting for the dark to swallow her, but the lights came back, weak and buzzing. She looked at the envelope, her heart pounding. She couldn't just leave it there, could she? The stranger had said to put it in the outgoing bin, but that felt wrong, like stepping into a trap. She thought about tearing it open, seeing what was inside, but her hands wouldn't move. What if it was dangerous? What if it wasn't meant for her eyes? She grabbed the envelope again, her fingers clumsy with fear. "Explain," she said, as if the stranger could hear her. "Tell me what this is." Her voice was loud in the empty room, but the only answer was the rain. She turned the envelope over, pressing it between her palms. It was still warm, still heavy, and now it seemed to hum, a faint vibration she could feel in her bones. She dropped it, gasping, and it landed on the counter with a slap. "No way!" she whispered, backing away. Envelopes didn't hum. They didn't feel alive. But this one did, and it scared her more than the stranger's eyes. Clara's eyes darted to the outgoing bin, a plain metal box by the counter. It was half full of letters, ready for the morning pickup. She could do what the stranger said, toss the envelope in and forget it. But what if that was a mistake? What if someone came for it and they weren't human? She shook her head, trying to laugh. "You're being ridiculous," she said, but the words felt hollow. The post office was getting to her, with its creaks and shadows and stories. Or maybe it was the envelope, whispering things she couldn't quite hear. She stepped closer to the counter, her hands hovering over the envelope. She didn't want to touch it again, but she needed to know. She needed to be sure. Just open it, she told herself. See what's inside, then decide. Her fingers brushed the edge, and the humming came back, stronger now, like a heartbeat. She yanked her hand away, her breath hitching. The lights flickered, and the shadows moved again, curling around the counter like smoke. Clara's heart raced. She was alone, but it didn't feel like it. Something was here, watching, waiting. The clock ticked to 9:52 p.m., 8 minutes until closing. Clara stared at the envelope, her mind spinning. She couldn't send it, couldn't open it, couldn't leave it. She was stuck, trapped by a piece of paper and a stranger's words. She thought about calling someone, her boss, a friend, anyone. But the phone was dead and the storm was too loud. She was on her own, in a post office that felt more like a cage. Then a sound cut through the rain, a soft tap, like a finger on glass. Clara spun toward the door, her heart in her throat. The stranger was back, standing under the awning, his hood hiding his face. He hadn't left. He'd been out there, watching her. His hand pressed against the glass, and his head tilted like he was studying her. Clara's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move, stepping toward the door. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The stranger didn't answer. He just smiled, his teeth yellow and sharp, and his eyes glinted under the hood, cold and hungry. Chapter 4. The Locked Door. Clara's heart pounded like a drum as she stared at the stranger through the rain-streaked glass of the hollow creak post office door. His yellow-toothed smile sent a shiver down her spine, and his eyes, glinting under his hood, looked like they could see right through her. The clock on the wall ticked to 9:53 p.m., 7 minutes until closing, but time felt meaningless now. The rain hammered the roof, a loud, angry roar that drowned out everything else. The envelope, plain and white, sat on the counter behind her, its strange warmth and weight lingering in her mind. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were glued to the creaky wood floor. The stranger's hand was still pressed against the glass, his fingers leaving smudges that blurred in the rain. He hadn't moved since she'd shouted at him, demanding to know what he wanted. His silence was worse than any answer, heavy and full of secrets. Clara's breath came in short, sharp gasps, fogging the glass in front of her. The post office felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, and the air smelled of wet dirt and something sour, like rotting leaves. She gripped the door handle, her knuckles white, and tugged. It didn't budge. She tugged again, harder, but the lock held fast. Her stomach dropped. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. The door had been unlocked seconds ago. She'd opened it to talk to the stranger. She twisted the lock, hearing the bolt click, but when she pulled, nothing happened. It was stuck, or something was holding it shut. Clara's eyes darted to the stranger. He hadn't moved, but his smile widened, like he knew something she didn't. Panic clawed at her chest. She banged her fist on the glass, the sound sharp and desperate. "What did you do?" she yelled. The rain swallowed her words, but the stranger's head tilted, like he was amused. Clara stumbled back from the door, her sneakers squeaking on the floor. The post office was dim, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed and hummed. The dark wood walls seemed to pulse, soaking up the light and casting long, jagged shadows. Stacks of letters and parcels cluttered the counter, their edges soft in the damp air. The rusty bell above the door swayed, jingling faintly, even though no one had touched it. Clara's skin prickled. She'd worked here for 2 years, sorting mail and chatting with customers. But tonight, the building felt alive, like it was part of the stranger's game. She turned to the counter, her eyes locking on the envelope. It sat there, blank and sealed, looking harmless but feeling like a trap. The stranger had told her to put it in the outgoing bin, said someone would collect it, someone who's been waiting. The words echoed in her head, cold and heavy, like stones sinking in water. She didn't know what he meant, but it scared her more than his smile. Clara's hands shook as she reached for the envelope, then stopped. It had hummed before, felt warm, like it was alive. She didn't want to touch it again, but she couldn't leave it there, staring at her like an eye. The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat. Clara gasped, her hand grabbing the counter to steady herself. When the lights came back, weak and buzzing, the stranger was still outside, his face pressed closer to the glass. His hood had slipped back a little, showing a gaunt cheek and that scar running from his ear to his jaw. His eyes were black, bottomless, like holes in the night. "No need to rush," he said, his voice muffled by the glass, but clear enough to make her flinch. It was the same low, scratchy voice, like dry leaves on pavement. Clara's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Get out of here!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "I'm calling the cops!" It was a lie. The phone was dead, killed by the storm hours ago. But she hoped it would scare him. The stranger didn't blink. His smile stayed, sharp and wrong, and he tapped the glass once, twice, like he was knocking to come in. Clara's heart raced. She backed away, bumping into the counter. A stack of letters fell, scattering across the floor. But she didn't care. She needed to get away from him, from that envelope, from this place. She spun around, her eyes scanning the room for another way out. The back door, down the narrow hallway, was her only chance. It led to an alley behind the post office, a muddy path that ran to the street. She'd used it before, tossing out trash or sneaking a break on slow days. But the thought of running through the storm in the dark made her stomach twist. What if the stranger followed her? What if he was waiting out there? Clara shook her head, trying to focus. She couldn't stay here, trapped with him watching her like a cat with a mouse. The post office had always been a quiet place, a boring job in a sleepy town. Clara had moved to Hollow Creek 2 years ago, looking for something simple after college. The town was small, with a diner, a grocery store, and houses that all looked the same. People were friendly, always waving or stopping to chat. But they loved their stories, especially about the post office. Built in 1893, it was the oldest building in town, and locals swore it was haunted. They talked about clerks who quit after hearing whispers or seeing shadows. One old woman, Mrs. Carver, said she'd found a letter in the bin with no address, written in a language she didn't know. Clara had laughed it off, thinking it was just small-town nonsense. Now, those stories felt real, like warnings she'd ignored. Clara grabbed her green jacket from the counter, slipping it on with shaky hands. The fabric crinkled, and the zipper felt cold against her fingers. She needed to move, to do something, but the envelope kept pulling her back. She glanced at it, her throat tight. It was still there, blank and heavy, like it was daring her to touch it. She thought about the stranger's hands, pale and dirty, trembling as he slid it across the counter. Why was it dry when his coat was soaked? Why did it feel warm, like it had a pulse? Her mind spun, trying to make sense of it, but nothing fit. The lights flickered again, and the bell jingled, louder this time. Clara spun toward the door, her heart in her throat. The stranger was still there, but the door was shaking, like someone was trying to open it. She hadn't heard the lock click again, but the handle rattled, metal clanging against metal. "Stop it!" she yelled, her voice high and desperate. The rattling stopped, but the stranger's smile grew, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. Clara's legs trembled. She wanted to cry, to scream, but she bit her lip, forcing herself to stay strong. She ran to the counter, grabbing the phone again, even though she knew it was useless. She pressed it to her ear, praying for a dial tone, but there was only silence. "Come on," she whispered, slamming it down. The storm had cut her off, left her alone in this creaky old building with a man who wasn't right. She thought about her life in Hollow Creek, how she'd come here to escape the chaos of the city. She'd wanted quiet, a place to think, but now she felt trapped, stuck in a town that felt smaller every day. Her dreams of a better job, a bigger life, seemed far away, buried under the weight of this night. Clara's eyes darted to the back door, down the hallway. It was her best shot, but the idea of running through the dark alley made her skin crawl. The post office was full of quirks, leaky pipes, loose floorboards, that crack in the wall she'd noticed earlier. She glanced at it now, thin and dark, like a cut in the wood. It seemed bigger, or maybe that was her fear talking. The building had always felt old, but tonight it felt alive, like it was working with the stranger to keep her here. She grabbed a letter opener from the counter. Its dull blade better than nothing. The metal was cold in her hand, and it gave her a spark of courage. "You're not getting in," she muttered, glaring at the stranger through the glass. He tapped the door again, slow and deliberate, like he was playing with her. Clara's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. She wasn't going to let him scare her into doing what he wanted. The envelope was still on the counter, and she wasn't going to touch it, not yet. She needed answers, needed to know what he was hiding. The rain roared louder, and the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness again. Clara gripped the letter opener, her breath hitching. When the lights came back, the stranger was closer, his face almost pressed against the glass. His smile was gone, replaced by a cold, hard stare. "Put it in the bin," he said, his voice clear despite the door between them. "Don't make me wait!" The words were like ice, slipping under her skin and freezing her blood. Clara's hand tightened on the letter opener, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. The door rattled again, louder, and she knew, deep down, that it wasn't the wind. She backed away, her eyes locked on the stranger. The envelope seemed to glow in the corner of her vision, a faint, unnatural light. Clara's mind raced. She could try the back door, risk the alley, or stay and face him. But the locked front door, the humming envelope, and the stranger's eyes told her one thing. This wasn't just a storm, and he wasn't just a man. The post office was hiding something, and she was caught in its trap. Chapter 5. The envelope's secret. Clara's breath came in short, shaky gasps as she backed away from the front door of the Hollow Creek post office. The stranger's face, pressed against the rain-streaked glass, burned in her mind. His yellow teeth, his cold black eyes, his voice like gravel. "Put it in the bin. Don't make me wait." The clock on the wall ticked to 9:54 p.m., 6 minutes until closing, but the storm outside made time feel like a lie. Rain pounded the roof, a loud, endless roar that matched the thudding of her heart. The plain white envelope sat on the counter, blank and sealed, but it seemed to stare at her, heavy with secrets she didn't want to know. The post office was dim, its flickering fluorescent lights buzzing like a swarm of flies. The dark wood walls soaked up the glow, casting shadows that twitched and danced. Stacks of letters and parcels cluttered the counter, their edges curling in the damp air. The floor creaked under Clara's sneakers, and the rusty bell above the door jingled faintly, as if touched by an invisible hand. The air smelled of wet paper, ink, and that sour, earthy tang that followed the stranger. Clara's hands trembled, still clutching the dull letter opener she'd grabbed for protection. It felt flimsy now, no match for whatever was happening. She glanced at the front door, locked tight despite her earlier attempts to open it. The stranger was still out there, under the awning, his hooded shape blurred by the rain. His hand no longer tapped the glass, but his presence felt like a weight, pressing down on her. Clara's stomach twisted. She wanted to run, to fling open the back door and sprint through the stormy alley to safety. But the envelope held her here, like a hook in her chest. It was warm, heavier than it should be, and it had hummed under her fingers, a faint vibration that made her skin crawl. Clara forced herself to turn away from the door, her eyes locking on the envelope. It sat alone on the counter, apart from the other mail, like it didn't belong. She stepped closer, her sneakers squeaking, and stopped a foot away. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. The envelope didn't answer, but it seemed to pulse, a tiny flicker of light in its corner that vanished when she blinked. Clara's heart raced. She wasn't imagining it. Something was wrong with this thing. Something that went beyond a creepy stranger and a stormy night. She set the letter opener down, her hands too shaky to hold it. The counter was cold under her palms, grounding her for a moment. Clara had worked in the post office for 2 years, sorting mail in this old building in Hollow Creek. The town was small, a quiet place where people knew each other's names and left their doors unlocked. She'd come here after college, looking for a simple life while she figured out her dreams. But the post office had stories, ones she'd laughed at until tonight. Locals said it was haunted, that letters moved on their own, that clerks heard whispers in the walls. Old Mr. Hargrove swore he'd seen a shadow in the back room, tall and thin, with no face. Clara had thought it was nonsense, but now those stories felt like truth, wrapping around her like the storm. She reached for the envelope, her fingers hovering over it. It was warm, she knew that, and it had hummed before like a heartbeat. Part of her wanted to tear it open, to see what the stranger was hiding. Another part screamed to leave it alone, to run and never look back. Clara's mind spun, replaying the stranger's words. Someone who's been waiting. Who? And why did it feel like the envelope was alive, like it knew she was here? She thought about the stranger's hands, pale and dirty, trembling as he slid it across the counter. His coat was soaked, but the envelope was dry. How? Nothing about him made sense. Not his voice, not his eyes, not his smile. The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness for a second. Clara gasped, her hand grabbing the counter to keep from falling. When the lights came back, weak and buzzing, the stranger was still outside, his face closer to the glass. His hood had slipped back, showing more of his gaunt face. Pale skin, a scar on his jaw, eyes like black holes. "Don't!" he said, his voice muffled but sharp, like a knife through the rain. Clara froze, her hand still hovering over the envelope. He hadn't said anything else, but that one word felt like a warning, like he knew what she was thinking. She pulled her hand back, her heart pounding. "What's inside?" she asked, her voice loud and desperate. She didn't expect him to answer, but she needed to break the silence, to push back against the fear. The stranger's head tilted, and his smile returned, slow and sharp. "A promise," he said, his voice clearer now, like he was standing next to her. "One I made, long ago." The words sank into her, cold and heavy, like ice in her veins. A promise? To who? And why was it here, in her post office, on this rainy night? Clara's eyes darted to the envelope. It was still, but she didn't trust it. She thought about the crack in the wall, the one she'd noticed earlier, thin and dark like a wound. The post office was old, full of quirks, leaky pipes, loose floorboards, scratches on the counter. But that crack felt different, like it was watching her. She glanced at it now, half expecting it to be bigger, but it was the same. A black line in the wood. The building had always been creaky, but tonight it felt alive, like it was part of the stranger's plan. She backed away from the counter, her sneakers scuffing the floor. The letter opener glinted in the dim light, and she grabbed it again, needing something to hold on to. "I'm not playing your game," she said, glaring at the stranger through the glass. Her voice was shaky, but it felt good to say it, to fight back. The stranger didn't move, but his smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard stare. The lights flickered again, and for a moment his shadow on the wall stretched, long and jagged, like it wasn't human. Clara's breath caught. Shadows didn't do that. They didn't twist and bend like something alive. She stumbled back, bumping into a stack of parcels. They fell, thudding to the floor, and the sound made her jump. The post office was full of noises, creaks, hums, the endless rain. But that shadow was wrong. Like a piece of the night had slipped inside. Clara's mind raced. She'd been in Hollow Creek long enough to know its stories, but she'd never believed them. The post office was just a building, old and falling apart. Ghosts weren't real. Shadows didn't move on their own. But the envelope, the stranger, the locked door, they were real, and they were here, trapping her. Clara's thoughts drifted to her life in Hollow Creek. She'd come here to escape, to find a quiet place to think. The town was small, with a diner where old men told stories and a grocery store that always ran out of milk. She'd liked it at first, the way everyone smiled and waved. But 2 years later, she felt stuck, like she was living the same day over and over. Her friends were in cities, chasing jobs and adventures, while she sorted mail in a building that smelled like rain and secrets. She wanted more, a career she loved, a trip to a faraway place. But those dreams felt impossible now, swallowed by the storm and the stranger's eyes. The rain roared louder, and the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness again. Clara gripped the letter opener, her knuckles white. When the lights came back, the stranger was still there, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes locked on hers. His shadow stretched across the wall, longer now, its edges sharp and wrong, like claws reaching for her. Clara's legs trembled, but she didn't look away. "What's the promise?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't know why she said it, but she needed to understand, needed to know why this was happening. The stranger's smile returned wider this time, showing more of his yellow teeth. "You'll see," he said, his voice low and rough, like it came from somewhere deep. The words were simple, but they hit her like a punch, stealing her breath. Clara's hand tightened on the letter opener, but it felt useless now, like trying to fight a nightmare with a stick. The envelope was still on the counter, and she could feel it, even from here, warm and humming, like it was waiting for her to make a choice. She thought about the back door again, down the narrow hallway. It was her only way out, but the alley was dark, muddy, and exposed to the storm. What if the stranger was waiting there? What if he wasn't alone? Clara's mind spun, picturing shadows moving in the rain, hands reaching from the dark. She shook her head, trying to focus. She couldn't stay here, not with him watching, not with that envelope pulling at her. But running felt like giving up, like letting him win. The post office creaked, a low groan that seemed to come from the walls. Clara froze, her eyes darting around the room. The crack in the wall looked darker now, like it was growing, but she told herself it was just the door light. The building was old, falling apart, nothing more. But the stories kept creeping back, whispers in the walls, letters that moved, shadows with no owners. Clara had laughed at them, but now they felt like clues, pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve. She stepped closer to the counter, her heart pounding. The envelope was still there, blank and sealed, but it seemed bigger now. Or maybe that was her fear talking. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched it. It was warm, hotter than before, and the humming was stronger, a steady pulse that matched her heartbeat. Clara yanked her hand back, her breath hitching. "No!" she said, loud and firm, like she was talking to the envelope itself. She wasn't going to open it, wasn't going to put it in the bin. Not until she knew what was happening. The lights flickered and the stranger's shadow stretched again, curling across the wall like smoke. Clara's eyes widened. It wasn't just long, it was wrong, with sharp edges and a shape that didn't match his body. It moved slow and deliberate, like it was alive. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were heavy, rooted to the floor. The stranger was still outside, his face pressed against the glass. But his shadow was here, inside, reaching for her. and the envelope, warm and humming, seemed to whisper, "You can't escape." Chapter 6. The post office's past Clara stood trembling in the dim light of the Hollow Creek post office, her back pressed against the counter, as the stranger's shadow twisted across the wall. It was long and jagged, not human, moving like a snake, even though he stood still outside the rain-soaked glass door. His words, "You'll see," echoed in her head, cold and sharp, like a blade against her skin. The clock ticked to 9:55 p.m., 5 minutes until closing, but the storm raging outside made the world feel distant, unreachable. The plain white envelope on the counter seemed to hum, its warmth and weight pulling at her like a magnet. Clara's heart pounded, and her hands shook, still gripping the dull letter-opener that felt useless now. The post office was a cage of shadows, lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that buzzed and sputtered. The dark wood walls drank the light, making the room feel tight, like it was squeezing her. Stacks of letters and parcels cluttered the counter, their edges soft and damp from the stormy air. The floor creaked under her sneakers, and the rusty bell above the door jingled faintly, as if stirred by a ghost. The air smelled of wet paper, ink, and that sour, earthy stench that clung to the stranger. Clara's breath came fast, fogging, in the chilly room. She wanted to run, to fling open the back door and escape into the rain, but fear held her fast, and the envelope wouldn't let her go. She glanced at the front door, locked tight despite her earlier struggles to open it. The stranger was still there, under the awning, his hooded face pressed close to the glass. His yellow-toothed smile was gone, but his eyes glinted, black and deep, like wells with no bottom. The shadow on the wall moved again, curling toward her, its edges sharp and wrong. Clara's stomach twisted. Shadows didn't do that. They didn't slither like living things. Her mind screamed that it was just the light, the storm playing tricks, but her heart knew better. Something was wrong with this place, with the stranger, with that envelope. Clara forced her eyes to the envelope, sitting alone on the counter. It was blank, sealed, and heavier than it should be, like it held a secret too big for paper. She'd felt it hum, warm and alive, and now it seemed to glow, a faint shimmer that flickered when she blinked. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice shaky and small. She wasn't talking to the envelope, not really, but to the fear choking her, to the post office itself. This building had been her workplace for 2 years, a boring job in a sleepy town. She'd sorted mail, stamped packages, and chatted with customers, never thinking it could turn into this, a trap of shadows and whispers. Hollow Creek was a small town, the kind where everyone knew your name and your business. Clara had moved here after college, looking for a quiet place to catch her breath. She'd wanted simple, and Hollow Creek gave it to her. A diner with greasy coffee, a grocery store that closed early, houses with tidy lawns. But the post office had stories, ones she'd heard over pie at the diner or whispered by kids on the street. Built in 1893, it was the oldest building in town, and locals said it was cursed. Letters vanished, they claimed, or showed up in the wrong bins. Clerks heard footsteps in empty rooms, saw faces in the windows. One old man, Mr. Hargrove, swore a letter had burned his hand once, written in ink that smelled like blood. Clara had laughed, thinking it was just talk to spook new folks. Now those stories felt like chains, tying her to this moment. She stepped closer to the counter, her sneakers scuffing the floor. The envelope was still there, and she could feel its warmth from here, like a tiny sun. She wanted to throw it away, burn it, anything to make it stop watching her. But the stranger's words kept her still. A promise, one I made long ago. What kind of promise came in a blank envelope, delivered in a storm? Clara's mind flashed to the stranger's face, pale, scarred, with eyes that didn't blink enough. He wasn't from Hollow Creek. She'd have known him, recognized his walk or his voice. This town was too small for strangers to hide. The lights flickered, and the shadow on the wall stretched, its claws reaching for the counter. Clara gasped, stumbling back. Her hip hit a stack of parcels, and they tumbled to the floor, thudding like stones. The noise was loud, sharper than the rain, and it snapped her out of her daze. "Get a grip," she muttered, her voice trembling but firm. She wasn't going to let this place or that man break her. She'd faced storms before, stayed late in creepy buildings, dealt with weird customers. But none of them had made her feel like this, like she was standing on the edge of something dark and deep. Clara gripped the letter opener, its cold metal grounding her. She turned to the front door, glaring at the stranger. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice cracking but loud. The glass muffled her words, but the stranger's head tilted like he heard every one. He didn't answer, just stared, his eyes glinting under his hood. The shadow moved again, sliding across the wall, and Clara's skin crawled. She wanted to look away, to pretend it was nothing, but she couldn't. It was real, and it was here, tied to the envelope and the man outside. She thought about the back door, down the narrow hallway. It was her only way out, but the alley was dark, muddy, and open to the storm. The idea of running through the rain, with the stranger maybe waiting, made her stomach churn. She pictured his pale hands, dirty and trembling, reaching for her in the dark. Clara shook her head, pushing the image away. She couldn't run, not yet. She needed to understand, needed to know why this was happening. The envelope was the key, but touching it felt like stepping into a trap. The post office creaked, a low moan that seemed to come from the walls. Clara froze, her eyes darting to the crack she'd seen earlier, thin and black like a scar in the wood. It looked deeper now, or maybe that was her fear talking. The building was old, full of quirks, leaky pipes, loose boards, scratches on the counter. But tonight it felt alive, like it was breathing with her. Clara's mind went to the stories, again, the ones she'd ignored. A clerk who vanished in the 1960s, leaving only a strange letter behind. A bin that filled with mail no one sent. Whispers in the walls, saying words no one could understand. She'd thought they were silly, but now they were loud, screaming in her head. Clara's eyes fell on the envelope again. It was still, but she didn't trust it. She stepped closer, her heart pounding like a drum. "What's your promise?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She wasn't talking to the stranger, not really, but to the envelope, to the post office, to whatever was making her feel this way. The lights flickered, and the humming came back, stronger now, a steady pulse that matched her heartbeat. Clara's hand hovered over the envelope, trembling. It was warm, too warm, and the paper felt smooth, almost alive. She yanked her hand back, her breath hitching. "No way," she said loud and sharp. She wasn't going to touch it, not again. But the stranger's voice cut through the rain, clear and cold despite the glass between them. "Put it in the bin, Clara." Her blood froze. She hadn't told him her name. She hadn't said it, hadn't worn a name tag, hadn't given him anything. Her legs wobbled, and she grabbed the counter to keep from falling. "How do you know my name?" she whispered, her voice so soft she barely heard it herself. The stranger didn't answer, but his eyes glinted, and his smile returned, slow and sharp. The shadow on the wall stretched, curling around the counter like a hand. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her voice was gone, stolen by fear. How did he know her? Had he been watching her, following her? She thought about her life in Hollow Creek, her quiet days sorting mail, her walks home to her small apartment. She'd never seen him before, never felt eyes on her back. But now it felt like he'd always been there, waiting for this night. Clara's mind raced, pulling up every story she'd heard about the post office. The vanished clerk, the burning letter, the shadows that moved. They weren't just stories anymore. They were warnings, pieces of a truth she'd ignored. She thought about her boss, Mr. Jenkins, who joked about the building having a mind of its own. She'd laughed, but now she wondered if he'd known something, if he'd seen things too. The post office was old, older than anyone in Hollow Creek, and it held secrets in its walls, its cracks, its shadows. She glanced at the crack in the wall again, her heart pounding. It was still there, dark and thin, but it seemed to pulse like it was breathing with the envelope. Clara's skin crawled. She wanted to believe it was just the light, just her fear, but she couldn't. The building was part of this, tied to the stranger and his promise. She thought about Hollow Creek, its sleepy streets and friendly faces. She'd come here for peace, but now she felt trapped, stuck in a town that hid darkness under its smiles. The rain roared, and the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Clara gripped the letter opener, her knuckles white. When the lights came back, the stranger was still there, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes locked on hers. His shadow was bigger now, filling the wall, its edges sharp and twisted, like a monster waiting to strike. Clara's breath came fast, and her hands shook. She wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The envelope was still on the counter, and it hummed louder, a pulse that seemed to call her name. She stepped back, her sneakers squeaking, and bumped into the counter. The letter opener fell, clattering to the floor, and the sound was like a gunshot in the quiet. Clara's eyes darted to the envelope, and she saw it, really saw it for the first time. It wasn't just paper. It was something else, something that didn't belong in her world. Its warmth, its weight, its hum. They were wrong. Like the stranger's shadow, like the crack in the wall. Clara's heart pounded, and her mind screamed one thing. This isn't just a storm. Chapter 7. The breaking point. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs as she stood in the Hollow Creek post office, the stranger's voice still ringing in her ears. "Put it in the bin, Clara." He knew her name, and she hadn't told him. The clock on the wall ticked to 9:56 p.m., 4 minutes until closing, but the storm outside made time feel like a trap. Rain pounded the roof, a loud, angry roar that shook the old building. The plain white envelope on the counter hummed, its warmth and weight pulling at her like a hand from the dark. The letter opener she'd dropped lay on the floor, glinting in the flickering light, useless against the fear choking her. The post office was a cage of shadows, its fluorescent bulbs buzzing and spitting like they were dying. The dark wood walls swallowed the light, making the room feel small, like it was closing in. Stacks of letters and parcels cluttered the counter, their edges curling in the damp air. The floor creaked under Clara's sneakers, and the rusty bell above the front door jingled faintly, as if someone unseen had brushed it. The air smelled of wet paper, ink, and that sour, earthy stench that clung to the stranger, even though he was outside, his face pressed against the rain-streaked glass. Clara's eyes darted to the front door, locked tight, no matter how hard she'd tried to open it. The stranger stood under the awning, his hooded shape blurred by the storm. His eyes glinted, black and cold, and his shadow stretched across the wall inside, long and twisted, like something alive. It curled toward the counter, its edges sharp and wrong, not matching his body. Clara's skin crawled. Shadows didn't move like that. They didn't slither or reach. Her mind screamed that it was the light, the storm, but her heart knew better. This wasn't just a creepy night. Something was wrong. Wrong with the stranger, the envelope, the post office itself. She forced herself to look at the envelope, sitting alone on the counter. It was blank, sealed, and heavier than paper should be, like it held a secret too big for this world. It had hummed under her fingers, warm and alive, and she'd seen it glow, a faint green shimmer that vanished when she blinked. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to throw it away, to run and never look back, but it held her here like a chain she couldn't see. The stranger's words echoed, a promise, one I made long ago. A promise to who? And why did it feel like the envelope was watching her, waiting for her to break? "I'm not doing it," Clara said, her voice loud and shaky. She glared at the stranger through the glass, her hands balled into fists. "I'm not putting it in the bin until you tell me what's going on." Her words felt brave, but inside she was crumbling, her legs trembling like they might give out. The stranger didn't move, but his eyes narrowed and his shadow twitched, curling closer to the envelope. Clara's stomach twisted. She'd worked in this post office for 2 years, sorting mail in a sleepy town where nothing happened. Hollow Creek was small, safe, the kind of place where people left pies on porches. But tonight, it was a nightmare, and she was trapped. The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Clara gasped, her hands grabbing the counter to keep from falling. The darkness lasted a heartbeat, then 2, and when the lights came back, they were weaker, buzzing like a dying bug. The stranger was still there, his face closer to the glass, his yellow teeth bared in a smile that made her blood run cold. The envelope glowed, a faint green light pulsing from its edges, unnatural and wrong. Clara's breath caught. Envelopes didn't glow. They didn't hum or feel warm. But this one did, and it was tearing her world apart. She stumbled back, knocking, over a stack of parcels. They crashed to the floor, loud as thunder, and the sound made her jump. The post office was full of noises, creaks, hums, the endless rain. But that glow was new, and it scared her more than the stranger's shadow. Clara's mind raced, pulling up every story she'd heard about this place. The post office was old, built in 1893, and locals swore it was cursed. They talked about clerks who quit after seeing shadows, hearing whispers. One woman, Mrs. Carver, said she'd found a letter in the bin with no address, written in red ink that smelled like rust. Clara had laughed, thinking it was just small-town talk. Now, those stories were alive, wrapping around her like the storm. Clara's eyes darted to the back door, down the narrow hallway. It was her only way out, but the alley was dark, muddy, and open to the rain. She pictured running through the storm, the stranger chasing her, his pale, dirty hands reaching from the shadows. Her stomach churned. She couldn't stay here, not with that glowing envelope and the stranger's eyes boring into her. But running felt like giving up, like letting him win. She thought about her life in Hollow Creek, how she'd come here for peace after college. The town was quiet, with a diner where old men told stories and a grocery store that always ran out of bread. She'd wanted simple, but now she felt stuck, her dreams of a bigger life buried under this night's fear. The lights flickered again, and Clara gripped the counter, her knuckles white. She needed to move, to do something, but the envelope's glow held her still like a spell. She thought about the stranger's hands, trembling as he slid it across the counter. His coat was soaked, but the envelope was dry. His voice was rough, his eyes empty, and he knew her name. How? She hadn't told him, hadn't worn a name tag, hadn't given him anything. The thought made her skin crawl, like he'd been watching her, waiting for this moment. Clara's eyes fell on the crack in the wall, the one she'd noticed earlier, thin and dark like a scar. It looked deeper now, like it was growing with her fear. The post office was old, full of quirks, leaky pipes, loose boards, scratches on the counter. But that crack felt alive, like it was part of the building's secret. She remembered her boss, Mr. Jenkins, joking that the post office had a mind of its own. She'd laughed, but now she wondered if he'd seen things, if he'd felt this same dread. The building was more than wood and nails. It was a keeper of promises, of shadows, of things that didn't belong. "I'm not scared of you," Clara lied, her voice loud in the empty room. She glared at the stranger, her hands shaking but clenched. "Tell me what's in it, or I'm tearing it up." She didn't mean it. She was too afraid to touch the envelope, but she needed to fight back, to feel like she had some control. The stranger's smile faded, and his eyes darkened, like storm clouds rolling in. "You don't want to do that," he said, his voice muffled by the glass, but sharp enough to cut. The shadow on the wall stretched, its claws reaching for the counter, and the envelope's glow pulsed brighter, like it was angry. Clara's legs wobbled, but she stood her ground. "I'm not your messenger," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm not part of this." She didn't know what this was, but it was bigger than her, bigger than Hollow Creek. The stranger had called himself a messenger, like her, but she was just a clerk, sorting mail for minimum wage, dreaming of a life somewhere else. The idea that they were the same made her skin crawl. like he was pulling her into his world, a place of shadows and promises she didn't understand. The lights went out, not flickering but dying, plunging the room into black. Clara screamed, a short, sharp sound that echoed in the dark. Her hands flailed, knocking over more parcels, and she dropped to her knees, scrambling for the letter opener. Her fingers found it, cold and smooth, and she clutched it like a lifeline. The darkness was thick, pressing against her eyes, and the rain's roar was louder now, like a beast outside the walls. But the envelope glowed, a green light cutting through the black, pulsing like a heartbeat. It lit the counter, the scattered letters, the crack in the wall, and Clara's hands trembling on the floor. She crawled backward, her breath coming in gasps. The glow was wrong, unnatural, like something from a nightmare. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The envelope was alive, and it was calling her, whispering words she couldn't hear. Clara's mind spun, pulling up every story, every warning. The vanished clerk from the 1960s, leaving a letter no one could read. The bin that filled with mail no one sent. The whispers, the shadows, the burning ink. They weren't stories, they were truth, and she was living it. The lights snapped back on, weak and buzzing, and Clara flinched, shielding her eyes. The stranger was still there, his face pressed against the glass, his shadow filling the wall. The envelope's glow faded, but it still hummed, a low pulse that matched her racing heart. Clara stood, her legs shaky, and gripped the letter opener. She wasn't staying here, not with that thing, not with him. She turned and ran for the back door, her sneakers pounding the floor. The hallway was narrow, dark, lined with boxes and old posters. The back door was at the end, a plain metal slab with a rusty lock. Chapter 8. The Truth Revealed. Clara crouched against the back door of the Hollow Creek post office, her heart pounding like a hammer as the stranger's laughter echoed through the dark hallway. The sound was low and rough, like stones scraping together, and it seemed to come from everywhere. Outside, inside, even the walls. The clock in the main room ticked to 9:57 p.m., 3 minutes until closing, but the storm raging outside made time feel like a cruel joke. Rain slammed the roof, a deafening roar that shook the old building. The plain white envelope on the counter, out of sight but not out of mind, hummed with a pulse that vibrated in her bones, its faint green glow lingering in her memory. The post office was a maze of shadows, its flickering fluorescent lights barely alive, buzzing like a dying wasp. The dark wood walls sucked up the light, making the narrow hallway feel like a tunnel. The floor creaked under Clara's sneakers, and the air smelled of wet paper, ink, and that sour, earthy stench that followed the stranger. Her hands trembled, empty now. The letter opener had slipped to the floor, useless against the nightmare closing in. The back door was locked, stuck tight like the front, trapping her in this creaky, breathing building. The stranger's shadow loomed at the hallway's end, tall and twisted, its claw-like edges moving even though he stood outside, his face pressed against the rain-streaked glass. Clara's breath came in short, sharp gasps, fogging in the chilly air. She wanted to scream, to bang on the door until someone heard, but Hollow Creek was asleep, swallowed by the storm. The stranger knew her name, Clara, and she hadn't told him. He'd called the envelope a promise, something he'd made long ago, and its hum, its warmth, its glow were wrong, like something from another world. Clara's mind spun, pulling up every story she'd heard about this place. The post office, built in 1893, was the oldest building in town, and locals swore it was cursed. They talked of clerks who quit after hearing whispers, seeing shadows. A clerk named Henry had vanished in 1962, leaving only a strange letter behind. Clara had thought it was gossip, small-town nonsense to scare kids. Now it was real, and she was trapped in its heart. She pushed herself up, her legs shaky, and pressed her back against the cold metal door. The stranger's laughter faded, but his shadow stayed, stretching down the hallway like a black river. Clara's eyes darted to the main room, where the envelope waited on the counter. Its hum was louder now, a steady beat that matched her racing pulse. She couldn't stay here, couldn't let that thing or the stranger win. But the doors were locked, the phone was dead, and the post office felt alive, its walls groaning like they were waking up. Clara's throat tightened. She wasn't just fighting a man. She was fighting this place, its secrets, its past. "Tell me what you want," Clara shouted, her voice cracking but loud. The words echoed, bouncing off the walls, and for a moment the rain seemed to quiet, like it was listening. The stranger's shadow twitched, and she heard a soft thud, like his hand hitting the glass. Clara crept forward, her sneakers squeaking, and peered into the main room. The stranger was still outside, his hood low, his eyes glinting like black stones. The envelope glowed faintly, its green light pulsing, lighting the counter and the scattered parcels around it. Clara's stomach churned. She wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The lights flickered, and the stranger spoke, his voice clear despite the glass. "You're stubborn, Clara," he said, low and rough, like he was amused. "But you'll do it." Her blood froze. He knew her name, her fear, like he'd been inside her head. She gripped the wall, her nails digging into the wood, and shouted, "How do you know me? What is this?" Her voice was desperate, but she needed answers, needed to understand why this was happening. The stranger's head tilted, and his hood slipped back, showing more of his face, pale, gaunt, with a scar running from his ear to his jaw. His eyes were empty, like they'd seen too much, and his smile was gone, replaced by a hard, thin line. Clara's mind raced, pulling up a memory. She'd seen that face before, not in person, but in a photo, faded and yellowed, at the town hall. It was part of a display about Hollow Creek's history, a picture of the post office staff from decades ago. One man, a clerk, had stood out, thin, pale, with a scar on his jaw. The caption said Henry Ellis, 1962, the clerk who vanished. Clara's heart stopped. It couldn't be him. That was over 60 years ago. He'd be old now, or dead, but the man outside looked like him, exactly like him, unchanged by time. "You're Henry?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. The stranger's eyes narrowed, and he nodded, slow and deliberate. "Good guess," he said, his voice heavy, like it carried years of pain. "I made a deal, Clara, a bad one." His words hit her like a punch, stealing her breath. A deal? With who? And why was he here now, with that envelope? Clara's legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand tall, her back still against the door. "What deal?" she asked, her voice shaking, but firm. "What's in that envelope?" Henry's face twisted, not quite a smile, not quite a grimace. "A promise," he said again, his voice softer now, like he was tired. "One I can't break." The envelope's glow pulsed brighter, and the hum grew louder, vibrating in Clara's chest. She glanced at it, her skin crawling. It wasn't just paper. It was something else, something tied to Henry, to this building, to the stories she'd ignored. Clara's mind flashed to Hollow Creek, her quiet life sorting mail, her dreams of leaving for a bigger city. She'd come here for peace, but she'd found this. A post office that breathed, a man who shouldn't exist, an envelope that glowed. The lights flickered, and the shadow on the wall stretched, its claws curling around the counter. Clara gasped, her hand grabbing the doorframe to steady herself. The post office groaned, a low, deep sound that seemed to come from the walls. The crack she'd noticed earlier, thin and black like a scar, looked wider now, like it was splitting open. Clara's heart pounded. This place was alive, part of Henry's deal, part of the curse that held him here. She thought about the stories again, the vanished clerk, the burning letter, the whispers in the walls. They weren't just tales, they were warnings, and she was living them. Clara pushed off the door, her sneakers scuffing the floor. She couldn't stay here, couldn't let Henry or the post office control her. She moved toward the main room, her eyes locked on the envelope. Its glow was steady now, green and cold, like swamp water. The hum was a song, low and eerie, pulling at her like a tide. Clara's hands shook, but she reached for it, her fingers hovering over the paper. It was warm, too warm, and the hum vibrated in her bones like it was speaking to her. She wanted to pull away, to run, but curiosity burned in her chest, stronger than fear. "What's the promise?" Clara asked, her voice loud and sharp. She glared at Henry through the glass, her hand still over the envelope. "Tell me, or I'm opening it." She didn't know if she meant it. Tearing it open scared her, but she needed to push him, to break his calm. Henry's eyes darkened, and he leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging it. "You don't want that," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's not for you." The words were simple, but they hit her hard, like a warning from someone who'd seen too much. Clara's hand trembled, but she didn't back down. "Then who's it for?" she shouted, her voice echoing in the empty room. "The envelopes." Hum grew louder, and the glow pulsed like it was angry. Henry's shadow twitched, stretching across the wall, its claws sharp and black. The post office groaned again, louder, like it was in pain. Clara's heart raced. She was done waiting, done being scared. She grabbed the envelope, its warmth burning her fingers, and tore it open, the paper ripping with a sound like a scream. Inside was a single sheet, folded once, covered in jagged, inky symbols that seemed to move, writhing like worms on the page. Clara's eyes burned, and her head throbbed, like the symbols were clawing into her mind. They weren't words, not any language she knew, but they felt alive, full of hate and hunger. The hum was deafening now, a roar that shook her bones, and the glow was blinding, green and cold, lighting the whole room. Clara gasped, dropping the sheet. and it floated to the counter, its symbols still moving, still watching. Henry's voice cut through the noise, sharp and desperate. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide with fear, not for her, but for something else. "It's awake now." The shadow on the wall grew, filling the room, its claws stretching to the ceiling. The post office groaned, the crack in the wall split wider, and the air turned heavy, like it was alive with menace. Clara's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, her hands covering her ears. The symbols, the hum, the glow, they were too much, tearing at her mind, her heart. She thought about Hollow Creek, her quiet days sorting mail, her dreams of a bigger life. She'd come here for peace, but she'd found this, a building that breathed, a man who was dead but not, an envelope that held something evil. The stories were true, and she was part of them, caught in a deal she didn't make. Clara's eyes darted to the sheet on the counter, its symbols writhing faster now, like they were trying to escape. She wanted to scream, to run, but the post office held her, its walls, its shadows, its past. Henry's voice came again, softer now, almost sad. "Put it in the bin, Clara," he said, "or it'll take you too." The words were a plea, not a threat, and they broke something in her. She looked at him, his pale face, his scarred jaw, his eyes full of pain. He wasn't just a stranger. He was Henry, the clerk who'd vanished, trapped by a promise he couldn't break. Clara's heart pounded and her hands shook, but she knew one thing. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Chapter 9. The Choice. Clara sat crumpled on the floor of the Hollow Creek post office, her hands pressed over her ears as the envelope's deafening hum shook her bones. The single sheet she'd torn from it lay on the counter, its jagged, inky symbols writhing like snakes, glowing with a sickly green light that lit the room. Henry's voice, desperate, almost sad, echoed in her mind. "Put it in the bin, Clara, or it'll take you too." The clock ticked to 9:58 p.m., 2 minutes until closing, but the storm outside roared like a beast, making time feel like a chain. Rain pounded the roof, shaking the old building, and the air was thick with the sour, earthy stench that clung to Henry, the vanished clerk from 1962 who stood outside, his scarred face pressed against the rain-streaked glass. The post office was a prison of shadows, its fluorescent lights flickering like they were gasping for breath. The dark wood walls swallowed the glow, making the room feel like a shrinking box. Scattered letters and parcels littered the counter, their edges soft in the damp air. The floor creaked under Clara's sneakers, and the rusty bell above the front door jingled faintly, as if stirred by an unseen hand. The crack in the wall, thin and black like a scar, pulsed wider, like it was breathing with the envelope's hum. Clara's heart thumped, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The letter opener she dropped was somewhere in the dark, useless against the nightmare trapping her. She lifted her head, her eyes darting to the sheet on the counter. The symbols moved faster now, twisting and curling like they were trying to crawl off the page. They burned her eyes, sending sharp stabs of pain through her head, like needles in her brain. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, but the symbols stayed, burned into her mind, full of hate and hunger. The hum was a roar, vibrating in her chest, and the green glow pulsed, lighting the shadows that danced on the walls. Henry's shadow was there too, long and jagged, its claw-like edges stretching to the ceiling, moving even though he stood outside, his black eyes watching her. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body felt heavy, like the post office itself was holding her down. Henry's words, "It's awake now," clawed at her, cold and sharp. What was it? The symbols? The envelope? Something worse? She thought about the stories she'd heard, the ones she'd laughed off. The post office, built in 1893, was cursed, locals said. Clocks heard whispers, saw shadows that weren't theirs. Henry Ellis, a clerk in 1962, had vanished, leaving a letter no one could read. Clara had thought it was small-town nonsense, but now she was living it, caught in a deal Henry had made, a promise that wasn't hers but held her anyway. She pushed herself up, her legs wobbly, and leaned against the counter. The sheet was inches away, its symbols writhing, its glow stinging her eyes. Clara's hands shook, but she forced herself to look at Henry through the glass. His face was pale, his scar glinting in the dim light, his eyes full of pain, not anger. He wasn't just a stranger, he was Henry, trapped by a curse, a deal he'd called bad. Clara's stomach churned. She didn't want to be like him, stuck in this place, bound to something she didn't understand. But the envelope's hum, the symbol's hunger, the post office's groans, they were pulling her in like she was already part of it. "Tell me what it is," Clara shouted, her voice raw and desperate. The words bounced off the walls, loud over the rain. "What's awake? What did you do?" She glared at Henry, her fists clenched, needing answers to fight the fear choking her. Henry's head tilted, and his mouth opened, but no sound came. His eyes widened like he was scared, not of her, but of something else. The shadow on the wall grew, its claws curling around the counter, and the crack in the wall split wider, a low groan rumbling through the floor. The envelope's hum spiked, a scream in her ears, and the symbols glowed brighter, like they were alive. Clara's heart raced. She couldn't stay here, couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, take her. She thought about Hollow Creek, her quiet life sorting mail, her dreams of leaving for a city full of light and noise. She'd come here for peace, but she'd found this, a building that breathed, a man who shouldn't be alive, symbols that moved like they wanted her soul. The post office was more than old wood and creaky floors. It was a keeper of secrets, a trap for clerks like her and Henry, and it wasn't letting go. She glanced at the back door, down the dark hallway. It was locked, like the front, but she wanted to try again, to bang on it until it gave. The alley outside was muddy, open to the storm, and Henry might be waiting, his pale hands ready to grab her. Clara shivered, pushing the thought away. Running wasn't enough. The envelope, the symbols, the hum, they'd follow her, or worse, they'd stay, waiting for the next clerk. She thought about her boss, Mr. Jenkins, who joked about the post office having a mind of its own. Had he known? Had he felt this, seen these shadows? Clara's throat burned. She was alone, cut off by the storm, the dead phone, the locked doors. The lights flickered, and the post office groaned, louder now, like it was angry. Clara's eyes darted to the outgoing bin, a plain metal box by the counter, half full of letters for the morning pickup. Henry had told her to put the envelope there, said someone would collect it, someone who's been waiting. The words were ice in her veins. Who was waiting? What was waiting? The symbols on the sheet seemed to pulse with her thoughts, their writhing, shapes sharper, like they were answering. Clara's head throbbed, and she pressed her hands to her temples, trying to block them out. She staggered to the counter, her sneakers squeaking, and stared at the sheet. The symbols were moving faster, curling into shapes that looked almost like eyes, watching her. The hum was a voice now, low and garbled, whispering words she couldn't understand, but felt in her bones. Clara's skin crawled. She wanted to tear the sheet, burn it, anything to make it stop. But Henry's warning, "It'll take you too," held her back. What if destroying it made things worse? What if it let it out? Clara's eyes flicked to Henry, still outside, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were desperate now, pleading, like he wanted her to listen. "Please, Clara," he said, his voice muffled but clear. "Put it in the bin. It's the only way." The words were soft, like he was begging, and they broke something in her. He wasn't a monster, not really. He was trapped like her, caught in a deal that had stolen his life. Clara's heart ached, but fear kept her sharp. She didn't want to be him, didn't want to be a shadow in this place, delivering cursed letters forever. The post office groaned again, and the crack in the wall split wider, a black gap that seemed to breathe. The shadows danced, Henry's claw-like shape growing, filling the room. The hum was deafening, the symbols' glow blinding, and Clara's head pounded like her skull was splitting. She thought about her life, her dreams, her quiet days in Hollow Creek. She'd wanted more, a job she loved, a city full of colour, a life that wasn't this. But the post office didn't care about her dreams. It wanted her choice, her surrender, her soul. Clara's hands shook, but she made up her mind. She couldn't destroy the envelope, couldn't run, couldn't fight the thing that was awake. The only way out was through, even if it scared her to death. She grabbed the sheet, its symbols burning her fingers, and stuffed it back into the envelope, the paper crackling like dry leaves. The hum spiked, a scream that made her ears ring, but she didn't stop. She sealed the envelope, her hands clumsy, and staggered to the outgoing bin. The metal was cold, ordinary, but it felt like a mouth, waiting to swallow her. "Don't make me do this," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. She looked at Henry, his eyes wide, his face pale. He didn't speak, but his nod was enough. Clara's heart pounded and her stomach twisted, but she dropped the envelope into the bin. It fell with a soft thud, landing among the other letters, and the hum stopped like a radio switched off. The glow faded, the symbols stilled, and the post office went quiet. The only sound the rain outside. Clara's legs gave out and she sank to the floor, her breath coming in sobs. The lights snapped back on, bright and steady, no more flickering. Clara blinked, shielding her eyes. The crack in the wall was smaller, just a thin line again, like it had never moved. The shadows were gone, the air lighter, the earthy stench fading. She looked at the front door, expecting to see Henry, but he was gone. The glass showed only rain and darkness, the awning empty. Clara's heart skipped. Had he been there at all? Or was he part of the post office, a ghost tied to its curse? She crawled to the counter, pulling herself up, and checked the bin. The envelope was there, blank and plain, no glow, no hum. It looked normal, like any other letter, but Clara knew better. It was a promise, a deal, and she'd sent it on to someone or something that had been waiting. Her hands shook and her eyes burned with tears. She'd done what Henry asked, but it didn't feel like winning. It felt like giving in, like she'd lost something she couldn't name. Clara thought about Hollow Creak, her quiet life, her dreams of leaving. She'd come here for peace, but she'd found this, a building that held secrets, a man bound by a curse, a choice that wasn't really hers. The stories were true, and she was part of them now, marked by the envelope, the symbols, the post office. She wanted to run, to quit, to leave this town and never look back. But the rain still fell, and the clock ticked to 9:59 p.m., 1 minute until closing. Clara sat there, staring at the bin, and wondered if she'd ever be free. Chapter 10. The Morning After. Clara sat slumped against the counter of the Hollow Creak post office, her breath coming in shaky sobs as the silence pressed around her. The clock ticked to 10 p.m., closing time, but the storm outside still roared, its rain hammering the roof like a fading drum. The plain white envelope, once humming and glowing with a sickly green light, was gone from her sight, dropped into the outgoing bin minutes ago. The symbols she'd seen, writhing inky shapes that burned her eyes, were quiet now, but their memory clawed at her mind. Henry, the scarred clerk from 1962, had vanished from the rain-streaked glass door, leaving only the echo of his plea. "Put it in the bin, Clara, or it'll take you too." Her hands trembled and her heart thumped, heavy with the weight of what she'd done. The post office was still, its fluorescent lights steady now, no longer flickering. The dark wood walls stood silent, their shadows soft and ordinary, no longer twisting like claws. Scattered letters and parcels lay across the counter and floor, knocked over in her panic, their edges curling in the damp air. The rusty bell above, the front door hung still, and the crack in the wall, once pulsing like a wound, was just a thin black line again, barely noticeable. The air smelled of wet paper and ink, the sour, earthy stench of Henry gone. But a faint chill lingered, like the building was watching, waiting. Clara's sneakers squeaked on the creaky floor as she shifted, her green jacket crinkling around her. She felt empty, like she'd lost something she couldn't name. She pulled herself up, her legs wobbly, and leaned against the counter. This outgoing bin, a plain metal box, sat nearby, filled with letters for the morning pickup. The envelope was in there somewhere, but Clara didn't want to look. She'd done what Henry asked, dropped it in to stop the hum, the glow, the writhing symbols that screamed in her head. The post office had gone quiet after that, the lights snapping on, the shadows fading, Henry disappearing. But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like surrender, like she'd given in to something bigger, something that wasn't done with her. Clara's throat burned, and her eyes stung with unshed tears. She wanted to go home, to her small apartment with its cosy lamp and warm blanket, but the storm and the night held her here. Clara's eyes darted to the front door, still locked, its glass streaked with rain. The street outside was dark, the streetlights flickering in the downpour. Hollow Creek was asleep, its diner closed, its houses shuttered against the storm. She thought about her life here. 2 years of sorting mail in this old building, dreaming of a bigger world. Hollow Creek was small, a quiet town where people waved and shared gossip over coffee. She'd come here for peace after college, wanting a simple life while she figured out her plans. But the post office had stories, ones she'd ignored. Whispers in the walls, shadows that moved, a clerk named Henry who vanished in 1962, leaving a letter no one could read. Clara had laughed at them, but now they were truth, carved into her like the crack in the wall. She moved to the bin, her heart pounding, and peered inside. The envelope was gone. Clara blinked, her breath catching. It had been there, blank and plain among the other letters. She'd felt it fall, heard the thud, but the bin held only ordinary mail. Bills, birthday cards, packages with neat labels. Her hands shook as she sifted through them, paper rustling, but there was no sign of the envelope, no hum, no glow. Clara's stomach twisted. Had it been taken? By who or what? Henry had said someone would collect it, someone who's been waiting. The words were ice in her veins, and she stepped back, her sneakers squeaking. The post office was quiet, but it felt wrong, like it was hiding something, waiting for her to turn away. Clara grabbed her green jacket from the counter, slipping it on with clumsy hands. The zipper was cold, the fabric damp from the nights. Chaos. She needed to leave, to lock up and walk the 3 blocks to her apartment, storm or no storm. The post office wasn't safe, not anymore. She thought about her boss, Mr. Jenkins, who joked about the building having a mind of its own. Had he known about Henry, about the envelope, about the deal? Clara's mind spun, pulling up every story she'd heard. The cursed post office, built in 1893, where letters vanished, where clerks saw things. Henry, trapped by a promise, his pale face and scarred jaw frozen in time. The symbols writhing like they wanted her soul. They were real, and she'd touched them, sent them on, become part of their curse. She moved to the front door, her keys jingling in her pocket. The lock clicked when she turned it, and the door opened easily, like it had never been stuck. Clara froze, her heart skipping. Hours ago it wouldn't budge, trapping her with Henry and his shadow. Now it swung wide, letting in a gust of cold, wet air. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the street outside glinting under the streetlights. Clara stepped onto the concrete step, her sneakers splashing in a puddle. The awning above dripped, and the air smelled of mud and leaves, but Henry's sour stench was gone. She looked back at the post office, its dim lights glowing through the glass, and shivered. It looked normal, but she knew better. Clara locked the door, the bolt clicking, into place, and turned away, pulling her hood up. The walk home was short, but it felt endless, every shadow a threat, every sound a footstep. The storm had left the streets empty, the houses dark, their windows like closed eyes. Clara's mind raced, replaying the night, the envelope's hum, the symbols' glow, Henry's desperate eyes. He'd said, "It'll take you too," and she'd listened, put the envelope in the bin to save herself. But had she? The envelope was gone, collected by something she couldn't see, and that scared her more than Henry's shadow. Her apartment was a small one-bedroom place on Maple Street, with a sagging couch and a lamp that flickered when it rained. Clara reached it in 10 minutes, her sneakers soaked, her jacket dripping. She fumbled with her keys, her hands still shaking, and let herself in. The warmth hit her like a hug, and she locked the door behind her, sliding the deadbolt, for good measure. The lamp glowed softly, casting a yellow light over the room, and the air smelled of coffee and laundry. Clara sank onto the couch, her breath coming in gulps, and buried her face in her hands. She wanted to cry, to scream, but she was too tired, too empty. She thought about Hollow Creek, its quiet streets and friendly faces. She'd liked it at first, the way everyone knew her name, the way the diner always had her order ready. But 2 years in, she felt stuck, her dreams of a city job or a faraway trip fading under the weight of routine. The post office had been her anchor, a steady job that paid the bills. Now it was a nightmare, a place of shadows and curses that had marked her. Clara's eyes stung, and she wiped them, her fingers wet with tears she hadn't felt fall. She couldn't go back, couldn't face that counter, that bin, that crack in the wall. Clara stood, her legs heavy, and moved to the kitchen. She filled a kettle, the water hissing as it hit the metal, and set it on the stove. The familiar routine calmed her, but not enough. She thought about the next day, about facing Mr. Jenkins, about telling him she was done. Quitting was the only way. She'd find another job, maybe at the diner or the grocery store, something far from the post office. Or maybe she'd leave Hollow Creek altogether, pack her bags and go somewhere new, somewhere without stories of ghosts and cursed letters. The idea felt big, scary, but it was better than staying, better than waiting for the next envelope. Kettle whistled, and Clara poured the water into a mug, dropping in a tea bag. The steam warmed her face, and she sat at her small table, the mug hot in her hands. She sipped, the tea bitter but soothing, and stared at the wall, her mind drifting. She saw Henry's face, his scarred jaw, his eyes full of pain. He'd made a deal, he'd said, a bad one, and it had trapped him, turned him into a messenger for something awful. Clara shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. She'd sent the envelope on, but what if it wasn't over? What if the post office wasn't done with her? Clara thought about the stories again, the ones she'd heard over pie at the diner. The vanished clerk, the burning letter, the whispers in the walls. They were true, and she was part of them now, a chapter in the post office's long, dark book. She wondered about the other clerks, the ones before Henry, the ones after. Had they seen things, felt things, made choices like hers? The thought made her skin crawl, like she was one of many, a name on a list that stretched back to 1893. Clara set the mug down, her hands shaking. She didn't want to be that, didn't want to be a ghost in someone else's story. The rain had stopped, the silence heavy outside her window. Clara stood and moved to the glass, peering out. The street was empty, the streetlights steady now, their yellow glow soft on the wet pavement. Hollow Creek looked normal, like nothing had happened. But Clara knew better. The town hid its secrets well, under smiles and waves, under the quiet of its nights. She thought about her friends, far away in cities, chasing lives she'd only dreamed of. She'd stayed too long, let herself get comfortable, but tonight had changed her. She wasn't the same Clara who'd walked into the post office hours ago. She went to her bedroom, a small space with a lumpy bed and a dresser covered in books. She pulled a suitcase from under the bed, its zipper stiff from disuse, and opened it. She didn't pack yet, but the act felt final, like a promise to herself. She'd quit tomorrow, tell Mr. Jenkins she was done, and start planning her escape. Maybe she'd go to a city, find a job in a museum or a library, something that didn't smell of ink and shadows. Or maybe she'd travel, see places she'd only read about. The future was big, uncertain, but it was hers, and she wouldn't let the post office take it. Clara lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind too loud to sleep. The night replayed in flashes, the envelopes hum, the symbols writhing, Henry's desperate eyes. She saw the bin, the missing envelope, the empty awning where Henry had stood. Something had taken it, something that had been waiting, and Clara didn't want to know what. She thought about the post office, its creaky floors, its crack in the wall, its stories. It was still there, waiting for the next clerk, the next storm, the next promise. Clara's eyes grew heavy, but sleep brought no peace. She dreamed of rain, of letters that glowed, of shadows that stretched too long. The next morning, Clara woke to sunlight, weak but real, streaming through her window. The storm was gone, the sky clear, Hollow Creek sparkling like it had been, washed clean. She dressed in jeans and a sweater, her movements slow, like she was carrying the night's weight. She walked to the diner, ordered coffee, and told the waitress she was quitting the post office. The words felt heavy, final, and the waitress nodded like she understood. Clara didn't go to the post office, didn't call Mr. Jenkins. She'd do it later, when she was ready. For now, she sipped her coffee, watching the town move on, oblivious to the darkness it hid. Clara left Hollow Creek a month later, her suitcase packed with clothes and books, her savings enough for a bus ticket. To a city 3 states away. She found a job at a small bookstore, shelving novels and chatting with customers, the work light and free of shadows. She never spoke of that night, never wrote it down, but it stayed with her, a scar she couldn't see. Sometimes, on rainy nights, she dreamed of the post office, of letters that hummed, of a bin that swallowed promises. And somewhere, in another small town, another clerk heard a knock at the door, sharp and loud in the middle of a storm.